Hello, good evening, and welcome to the members of the Community Stakeholder Forum, and welcome to the wider viewing audience. As we often have new members on the panel and new people viewing each week, I'm going to run through a quick introduction as I do at the start of each meeting. So this forum is part of an innovative approach adopted by Uttlesford District Council to engaging the whole community in conversations about shaping the future of the district through its local plan. At the heart of this approach is an open public consultation taking place over several months rather than the usual weeks. The plan itself has been broken down into smaller topics which can be more easily debated and commented upon. Every couple of weeks, this forum meets for a presentation on a particular topic. The forum is made up of people who represent different interest areas across the region. It cannot represent every interest area or every group of residents. The forum debate that follows each presentation is designed to stimulate the public consultation that follows each meeting, and it is important to note that the public consultation is the most important element of this process. It is really vital that all stakeholders contribute to the debate. Please use your networks of contacts to share this forum presentation and to encourage participation and comment, especially to involve members of the community who may not otherwise make their voices heard. If you go to the UDC website and search the new local plan, you'll find various buttons that allow you to submit your views under each topic. At the end of this consultation period, Uttlesford District Council will consider all the representations received during the consultation and consider them when drafting the local plan. So to be clear, this group is independent of the council, is not a decision-making body, and its members' views will not override those contributed by the wider community throughout the public consultation. Participants have been asked to make contributions from the perspective of their special interest area, rather than to advance any personal or professional agenda, such as in relation to their place of residence or the interests of a specific organisation. Now, turning to this evening's meeting, which is about biodiversity, we're going to hear a short presentation and we'll then move to initial discussion amongst the panel and viewers on Zoom will have the opportunity to submit and upvote any questions to the forum. So the chat function is disabled if you're watching on the webinar, but you are able to submit questions through Q&A. But please note, we are only able to ask at most 3 questions from the public. So if you see your question or something relating to your question on the Q&A, please upvote the question rather than putting it on again, because that makes it more likely to be asked at the end. And now it gives me great pleasure to welcome Andrew Lovett from University of East Anglia, who's going to talk to us about biodiversity. Thank you, Andrew.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you this evening. Just to introduce myself, I'm a professor of geography at the University of East Anglia in Norwich. And in the last 3 years in particular, I've been working with Essex County Council on several projects, and in particular to produce some data and maps for them on the distribution of green infrastructure in Essex. And that's what I'm going to briefly talk about tonight, and why green infrastructure is important for biodiversity. And I'm going to explain a little bit about the work that we've done and what it tells us about the characteristics of green infrastructure in Essex and Uttlesford more specifically. And then I'll finish by talking about what I see as some of the key opportunities in the future that can be taken forward by this forum and work on future planning in Uttlesford. So if you can go on to the next slide, please. So I think it's useful to start by briefly saying, what do we mean by green infrastructure? You can see a little definition at the top of the slide there. This comes from a government planning document, Planning Policy Statement 12. So it's a network of green space, both urban and rural, which supports natural and ecological processes and is integral to the health and quality of life of sustainable communities. And in terms of types of green infrastructure, it can be very diverse. It can be areas like parks and gardens, amenity green space like village greens, many different types of natural and semi-natural green spaces, so woodland, grassland, coastal features, many types of green corridors, rivers, cycle routes, footpaths, and so forth, and areas like allotments and churchyards and sports facilities. So it's very diverse. You can think of green infrastructure as a form of natural capital that provides multiple services and multiple benefits to us in terms of things like food, clean water, air quality, the natural world in all its wonders, landscape views, and so on and so forth. But amongst the many different sorts of benefits that green infrastructure provides, of course, the different types of green areas are also a key support for biodiversity. So by thinking about where we've got green infrastructure and how we might enhance it, we're also thinking about how we could do both of those functions for biodiversity. And by biodiversity, we mean the variety of life on Earth. So that can be genetic diversity, can be species diversity, and it can be diversity in different habitats and ecosystems. So the diversity of the living world, if you like. Next, please. So I have been working with people at Essex County Council and the University of Essex, and we were basically asked to do some work that would allow us to provide the analysis that underpins the Green Essex Strategy, which is a strategy document that was published by the County Council last year and is available on their website, and you can see the link there. And this is a document that was produced by the County Council as a strategy for trying to champion, expand and develop green space and green infrastructure across Essex. And as part of this, it was important to try and map different types of green infrastructure on a county-wide scale. And this is one of the particular things that myself and my colleagues have been involved in doing. So if you can go on to the next slide, please. This is the map of green infrastructure in Essex that we produced. It's very brightly coloured, partly reflecting the sheer variety of different types of green infrastructure assets that you can see in Essex. To generate this, we had to take about 20 different data sets in map form, overlay them using a computer tool known as a geographical information system, and then combine them to produce a map here. And it's a very detailed map once you zoom into it, but you can get an overview here. So overall, combining all these different types of features, we have about 78,000 hectares of green infrastructure in Essex, and that's about 21% of the whole county. About 42% of that is natural and semi-natural open spaces, grasslands, coastal areas, other open spaces, and so forth. There's important areas of woodland, there's important coastal features. In the towns and cities, you have other key areas like parks and gardens, sports facilities, amenity green spaces, allotments, and so on and so forth. So that's a very detailed map. What we can also do is look at how it compares across the different authorities in Essex. So if you can go on to the next map, please. This shows on the left-hand side the same green infrastructure, but now presented as a percentage of the area of different local authorities. And you can see that there's quite a distinct pattern in Essex where basically there are higher percentages towards the south of the county and lower percentages in the north. And that reflects other characteristics of land use, because of course in areas in the north of Essex, particularly in, for example, districts like Uttlesford and Braintree, you've got more areas of productive agricultural land, you've got more areas of crops, you've got more areas of pasture. And so you can see that on the right-hand map in terms of much higher percentages of productive spaces, farmland, crops, grassland, and so forth in those counties. So we've got different patterns of land use across the different authorities in Essex. And we can also look at how the access to green space varies across the county. So if you can go on to the next slide, please. One of the ways that that has done is by using something called an accessible natural green space standard. And it's got 4 benchmarks, and they are essentially related to sizes of areas of green space at different distances from population. So an area 2 hectares in size within about 5 minutes walk, or an area that's 100 hectares size within 5 kilometers, and so on and so forth. Well, we can use population distributions and the data I've just shown you to map out the extent to which those different benchmarks are met across Essex. So if you can go to the next slide, please. This is what that map looks like for Essex, using also areas around the county. So the number of benchmarks that are met, basically about 50% of the population of Essex lives in areas which meet at least 3 benchmarks. About another third live in areas that meet 2. And there are smaller areas, and particularly some areas, as you can see, in parts of northern Essex, in Uttlesford and Braintree and so forth, where those benchmarks are not met in terms of accessible green space, largely because those areas are farmland and access to them is in a different sort of way. So you need to think here particularly about factors like the distribution of footpaths and paths and so forth. So if you go on to the next map, what we also did was map out all those public rights of way and promoted paths in Essex. So you can see the distribution of these here. So there's about 6,500 kilometres of footpaths and public rights of way across Essex. You can see the longer distance promoted routes highlighted on the map, but an awful lot of other public rights of way and footpaths as well. And the network of those is particularly dense in areas of farmland. And you can see that there's a lot of such routes in districts like Uttlesford and Braintree. And if you can go on to the next slide, please. That's actually reflected when you look at the density of these footpaths across the different authorities. So here, what we've calculated is the length of the public rights of way in terms of meters per hectare. So it's like a density measure. And Uttlesford actually has the highest density of the footpaths and public rights of way of all the local authorities in Essex. So this is a very important feature in terms of the population of Uttlesford being able to access all sorts of different types of green assets and so forth. So that just gives you a very quick overview of some of the key characteristics. If we can go on to the next slide, please. I'd just like to finish with a few future opportunities, because I think these are really important things to think about in terms of your current discussions. There is an environment bill going through Parliament at the moment, which I think will become law later on this year. It sets up requirements for biodiversity net gain in planning applications. So this means that developers of large projects in the future, such as new housing estates, will have to include in those proposals for biodiversity net gain, either on the sites that they're developing or elsewhere. And this will create a lot of scope for new or enhanced green infrastructure, and also for other types of habitat creation and enhancement. And linked to those requirements, local authorities are going to be asked to develop local nature recovery strategies, which will be locally led and will give the opportunity to think about, well, where would we want new green infrastructure or new habitats to be created and enhanced. So this is a really key opportunity in the future. Linked to that, in an area like Uttlesford, you've got a lot of agricultural land. Well, the agricultural policies of the country are going to undergo a lot of change on a time scale of the next 5 to 7 years. There's going to be changes in agricultural policy support. There's going to be new schemes that will allow farmers and landowners to apply for money that will enhance the delivery of environmental benefits, what the government often refers to as public money for public goods. And this will provide all sorts of opportunities for nature recovery, and also for thinking about things on a landscape scale, rather than, say, a smaller field or individual farm scale. And lastly, there are other initiatives related to green recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. The government's plans to implement a 25-year environment plan for England, and also to achieve, net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. These are going to provide all sorts of other opportunities for changes in land use that can enhance green infrastructure and can enhance biodiversity. And what is starting to happen now around the country is that groups of organizations, local authorities and other agencies, NGOs and so forth, are getting together and trying to think about, well, how do we, want to plan for these? What do we want to try and achieve? So I've currently been involved in producing a natural capital evidence compendium for Norfolk and Suffolk that was published last year. And there's similar initiatives now starting, I know, in Essex as well, particularly as part of some of the county council's climate change and land use initiatives. So I think there's a lot of important opportunities there. Thank you very much. I hope that was interesting. I hope it was helpful, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Andrew, thank you so much. That was incredibly interesting and enlightening on the use of land across Uttlesford. Now, we do have occasionally some guest people on the stakeholder forum, and I believe we have at least one with us today. I'm going to come to you, Tony, first, because I'm not sure we've got Neil with us. So Tony Morton, welcome to Community Stakeholder Forum. Would you like to add anything or comment on Andrew's presentation? And perhaps you could just tell us briefly who you are as well. Hello, Tony, can you hear? Yes, you can hear me, good.
Hello, I've just unmuted that. Does that work?
That does work, we can hear you. Perhaps you could just introduce yourself and give us your thoughts on biodiversity.
Tony Morton, I volunteer for Essex Wildlife Trust. I've done that for about 30 years. I'm the warden at Shadwell Wood. Used to work in local government as a town planner. Been retired about 10 years.
Great, thank you. Perhaps you could give us your thoughts on this topic and maybe respond to Andrew's presentation or any other thoughts you want to add.
I hardly know where to start.
Can I give you then 4 minutes?
Okay. I mean, to me, the whole philosophy of this approach is unethical because it's all anthropocentric. It's all about what value does the natural world have for humans. We're putting ourselves first, as we have done for centuries, if not thousands of years. All the other species are in trouble, not because of something that's inherently wrong with them, but because we eliminate them. We're destructive, greedy, and our population has swollen to a level that the world cannot support. Every survey of species over the past decades reports a further decline from the previous survey, And our development has devastated the natural world. And if you watched David Attenborough's programs recently, you can't be in any doubt that we're already living inside an ecological catastrophe. It's not coming to us, it's already here. It's happening all around us. And yet we're still talking about more development and doing a bit of green fringery to offset the impact of that development without acknowledging the damage we've already done and trying to put that right. And the whole thrust of local planning is about providing things for people. We never think about what do other species need. Pick a species at random, badgers. What do badgers need to live? You can't protect just one badger. You've got to protect a whole population of them. They've got to have enough space to live in, enough food, shelter, and security. And you can substitute for badgers any species you want to choose. Oxlips, daffodils, you name it. They need their space. And at the moment, we're eliminating them by using all the space up. And this whole green infrastructure approach is morally bankrupt.
Thank you, Tony. Is that have you finished what you want to add?
Anything more devastating to say?
No, it's pretty powerful stuff. Andrew, did you want to respond to that at this point, or would you like to hear a few more contributions?
I'd quite like to hear a few more contributions.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Tony. Who would like to contribute something next? If you could let me know by raising your hand, either electronically or literally. I think everyone's still taking in all of that. Richard.
Am I successfully unmuted?
You have.
Yeah, well, first of all, just to say I do have some sympathy with Tony on that point, and I would say that I am a member of Essex Wildlife Trust. So I do sympathise, but at the same time, this is at least an attempt to allow man to live in a little bit more harmony with nature. So, I mean, I do also applaud this initiative, be it by Essex, be it by Uttersford, towards allowing a slightly increased amount of biodiversity. But I just had a question ready for Andrew. You talked about the Environment Bill and allowing developers to offset their biodiversity gain on off-site. What I'm concerned about slightly is that isn't there going to be a bit of double counting here? Because the Agriculture Bill 2020 is set, I think, to encourage farmers to take land out of food production and push it very much towards biodiversity projects. So isn't there just going to be a deal between the developers and the landowners? And actually, we're not going to get sort of two sets of biodiversity improvement. We're just going to get one because they'll do a deal with the landowner and it'll be the same piece of land. So is that a concern?
If you'd like me to respond,
yes, sorry.
I understand entirely the point you're making, and I can see why it's an important thing to think about. It's going to be very important to think about how some of these objectives related to biodiversity net gain are implemented. This is one of the challenges that district councils like Uttlesford are going to have. You're going to have the opportunity to make those requirements in planning approvals, but you've then got to think about how you're going to monitor them over time and see what actually happens and whether the aspirations that were put forward initially were achieved. Yes, there is going to be there is going to be potential for overlap, but there's also the potential opportunity to do things on a landscape scale in terms of connectivity of habitats and making landscapes more resilient in a way that has not been feasible previously. So I appreciate the caution that you're expressing, but I also think that there's some big opportunities here as well.
Can I just,
Richard, yes, come back briefly.
Can I just come back with a quick point? Yes, just a plea then, in which case to the planners that are present. It's all about enforcement. We have seen so many cases of developments being carried out with requirements for landscaping, and they've just not been carried out, and there's been no pursuit of those developers to pursue them. They've moved on to other sites, and no one does anything about it. And so not only do you have the blighting of the landscape with developments providing a sort of a stark backdrop to what was previously a rather attractive landscape, but I mean also there is no attempt at creating habitats for species. So I think that is just a plea to the planners to make sure that any section 106 that is entered into with regard to landscaping is actually carried out, and for example dead trees are replaced. So that's just a one-off point.
Thank you, Richard. Just a quick reminder to people watching on the webinar to submit their questions on the Q&A and check that their questions aren't already there. And if they are, please upvote them, because we will have a chance for a few questions at the end of this discussion. Edward, I think you had your hand up next.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Angela. I'd like to start at the other end of the food chain with the soil, because soil contains kind of billions. Every handful of soil contains billions of microorganisms and invertebrates and bacteria. And that wealth must be acknowledged in the local plan. In every development, the biodiversity contained in the topsoil should be considered as a fundamental element of the environmental assets of the site. And I don't know whether it gets counted, but I think it needs to be counted when they're looking at kind of the biodiversity sort of the value of a site. And especially if you're looking for a net gain of 10% after any development, I want the soil and the biodiversity of the soil to be counted in that net gain calculation. I don't know if you've ever bought a new house or gone in to visit some friends who've bought a new house and gone into their garden, and you go out and you're thinking, wow, where's all the topsoil gone? In the words of that lovely Joan Baez thing, where's all the topsoil gone? And they've put a few manky turfs down on top of subsoil, and the topsoil has disappeared. Always, in my experience, always. And I presume that developers just flog it off, and I think they should be prevented from doing that. I think there should be a license needed to remove any topsoil from a site. Obviously, you need to shift it from not going to do any good underneath the footprint of a building. So there are cases when you might shift it, but then use it. But I don't see that it is there as an asset of the developer, that topsoil. And I've also got some suspicion about playing fields. There's a local playing field around here, and I went along with my little trowel and had a look at the quality of the soil under the grass of this playing field, and it's definitely subsoil. The whole area of 2 football pitches of topsoil, I think, has been removed because the grass is growing in really crummy stuff. Soils have an amazing additional ability to sequestrate carbon from the atmosphere, and we need to maximize the chance of them doing that. And I think we need a strategy that is going to maximize that sequestration. And I think that policy should include judicious use of solar farms. I think we need a nuanced policy with regard to solar farms, one that will encourage greater botanical diversity of wildflowers and hedgerows, which provide pollen for insects, bees and honey production, and as well as nesting for and food supplies for birds and bats. But the bit that really excites me about this, the potential here, is that the grass growing unharvested, like a medieval fallow field, dies back into the soil, and it takes the sugars it's been generating through photosynthesis, takes those sugars back into the ground, and that gives the energy, that gives the food to encourage new microorganisms, microorganic life and invertebrates in the soil. So I think you've got a potential of clean energy production, carbon sequestration, increased biodiversity, and then after a decade or two, you can return that restored soil back into agricultural use and start growing much better, healthier food on it without the need for artificial fertilizers. So it's a quadruple win. And I think we probably need more research on it. I'm not an expert, but I just have a feeling that this is a way forward. The next bit, I won't go all the way up the food chain, but insects. We have lost 75% of our flying insect biomass over the last 30 years. That's why you don't wipe insects off your windscreen anymore. And our lives depend on insects. And the economic value of flying insects pollinating agricultural land is over £500 million a year. And we're losing them at a rate of 2.5% a year. And we lost 58% of butterflies in the first decade of this century. So we have got to have a strategy that gets insect life back up. And I think we need to identify road verges of value and rewild them. And we've got existing special road verges, but we need to increase those at least tenfold. And those will create corridors as well for wildlife. I think we need to set a target of 25% for every cemetery and every churchyard in Uttlesford that can be stopped being mowed and be rewilded and grow wildflowers to provide the habitat for those insects, and identify other public areas around Saffron Walden or around anywhere in Uttlesford, the castle or whatever, for rewilding and wildflowers. And finally, I'm not going to do trees because I'm going to trust someone else to do trees.
Just do 1 minute, Edward. Just
one more minute. Just the rivers.
Hands up.
Yeah, thank you. We need to exclude or put very specific conditions on development that is close to our rivers or our groundwaters, because we're in a chalk farm area, a chalk upland area with very precious kind of alkaline water and a very particular ecosystem. We need to increase the standards of water conservation on new builds. We must reduce the permitted discharge levels of phosphates from agricultural land into our rivers. And I think development should only be permitted when developers can provide assurance that there will be no further reduction in the level of our aquifers. If we lose our aquifer, we're sunk.
Thank you so much. I knew that this would be a very big subject. So just to say to anybody who doesn't feel that they're able to make all of their points, of course, please go to the council website and make your points there. And of course, make all of your points there, because this is just a discussion. The main point for the main way of making your point for the local plan is through the UDC website. Frank, could I come to you next, please?
Yes, please. Thank you very much. Yeah, just a couple of points. Nice to pick up on what Edward just said. I've got a note here about sustainable drainage systems that are all the talk of developers. These need to be maintained across the life of the entire estate. And the trouble is, it's the responsibility and funding for this maintenance actually needs to be very well defined before a project actually gets to break ground, because otherwise it's probably not going to happen. And the trouble is, once these sustainable drainage systems lose their maintenance, you've then got risks of overflows or discharge of wrong materials into the wrong places, flooding affecting adjoining properties, this kind of problem, and obviously impact on all the wildlife habitats that are associated. But one other comment, from my own experience of reading a lot of planning applications, I get the strong impression that ecological reports are commissioned by developers and they're not very reliable. They seem to fail to notice protected species. They visit at the wrong time of year. They view the site from outside the boundaries, so they don't actually see it properly. They often base their reports on a desktop review of outdated records, and they don't speak to the neighbours who actually know the area. So my suggestion here is that ecology reports really ought to be conducted by independent consultants who aren't required to support the developer's view. Who pays for it? Well, ultimately, the developer should pay for it, but the choice of consultant and the content of the report is not down to the developer, it's down to the planning authority. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. Thank you for that. Eleanor, could I come to you next, please?
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to sort of react to what Tony Morton said. So I think I see where he's coming from, and I don't want to say that I'm not disagreeing with him or what Edward said, and I fully support that we need to focus on biodiversity and things. But with what Tony was saying about weighing up a person against a badger, it seems clear to me that we would choose the person, to be honest. And obviously there is a reason that these houses need to be built. I don't think it's not like they're going to sit empty. People do need them. So I don't think we can just stop all building, stop all development, and just go back and, as he was saying, eliminate the past. And in fact, I think maybe even that would be more morally bankrupt than not building these houses if people need them. So yeah, and also I can't remember whoever was speaking first, said that we do have 78,000 hectares of green infrastructure. So I don't know, I'm not sure if that's really an ecological catastrophe. And I understand that maybe we're going that way, but I hope that with these things on the feedback and the documents we read before the meeting, it mentioned we're going to try maybe 20% harder rather than 10%. To work on that. I think we can still do things whilst developing rather than just coming to a complete standstill and not making any progress.
Thanks very much, Eleanor. Good to hear some different views there. Andrew, would you like to come back on any of the things that you've heard so far? You can see there's a lively group here with different viewpoints and interests.
Yes, I mean, there's a diversity of opinion, but the diversity of opinion is something that exists nationally and it exists globally, and it's a challenge we face in trying to think about our future. I would agree very strongly that things to do with soil and the management of soils will become more important in the future. They're important for biodiversity. They're things to do with carbon sequestration, things to do with climate change mitigation. Soils are absolutely fundamental to that. And I think the other point I'd just like to make, these policy initiatives that are coming along from now in the next 5 to 10 years, they often really substantial opportunities that have not been around before. They offer very big opportunities for NGOs like the wildlife trusts, the RSPB, the National Trust and whoever, or individual landowners, to do things differently that will enhance the environment and support biodiversity. And many of those opportunities have not been there before.
Thank you. That's a really good point. Thank you, Andrew. Samantha, would you like to make some comments?
Yes, thank you. Yes, it was interesting to see the maps that Andrew Lovett presented and how they showed that Uttlesford has mainly agricultural land, I think, and lots of public rights of way, as does Uttlesford in general. And I wondered if there was an opportunity to maybe create some kind of public recreation space in order to create more biodiversity. So maybe if there was a site that was suitable to identify that, so that we do have access to nature because I think we do tend to, during this pandemic, all walk along these public rights of way through the fields, but there isn't anywhere to have a high quality of leisure. There aren't really the parks and gardens or the proper places to sit down and to enjoy nature. So that would be a really lovely thing to happen if it could happen. Also, I wondered with climate change and the climate crisis, we see in other countries that people that tend to be affected are those people that are poorest. And I wonder if we would also see that here in Britain, and we need to make sure that we look after those people who live in the poorer quality housing that doesn't have access to really any of this green capital or green infrastructure that we've talked about, to make sure that those spaces are available for everyone to actually enjoy would be really important to me. Also, I wondered about the sustainable water use, which other people have mentioned too, because I'm aware that the Cam and other rivers in Britain are being quite seriously polluted by agricultural use and also discharge of raw sewage into the rivers. So it's really important that we should get on top of that as a nation. I don't think we're there yet. We still see the damage that's being done to our rivers, and we need to tackle that to make sure it's properly taken care of, because that is part of the requirement for biodiversity around the river and that green corridor. As for new developments, I would like to see proper green spaces included in developments. Very often we see things that look like real urban developments in Uttlesford, in my local area, and not enough provision of green space, including the space for biodiversity. So proper green space. I can't really quantify hectares in my mind and what that should look like, but I'm sure it's bigger than what's being provided in terms of pocket parks. So also, yeah, we do have to travel very far to get to our green spaces. So I would like to see that park being provided. As to ancient woodlands that were mentioned, we even have those locally, but we don't really get access to them. And I'm not, so for instance, in Shortgrove Estate, there are ancient woodlands. I'm not really sure they're adequately protected from development, because we do see development in the registered park and garden. And possibly it needs greater protection as woodland. Yes, that's all I'd like to say. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Samantha. Janet, come to you next.
Sorry, two completely different points. I was quite surprised at the amount of rights of way we apparently have. Already on previous forum meetings, we've discussed the fact that a lot of our popular open spaces are overcrowded and therefore being overused. And even on some of the more distant paths, as a walker, I would say that you come across a lot more people than you expect. And many of the paths are overwalked. So we may statistically have quite a lot, but I think we need a lot more of them and better access to them. So that's on one point. On the other side, from what I'm meant to be here for, which is around employment and economy, I think with biodiversity and sort of the whole environment agenda, we do have an opportunity for the development of green businesses and better training from everything from sort of architecture, design, plumbing, construction and everything else, to make sure that the workforce has the skills that are needed to deliver some of the projects that we might have in the future.
Thank you very much, Janet. Thank you. Is there anybody that hasn't made a point yet? John. Thank you.
Sorry about that. My first attempt at unmuting didn't work. Yes, I mean, I'm not quite sure how to describe the faith angle on this, except to say that I actually think it's an important part of our own emotional and spiritual well-being to have that sense of connection with the created world. So whilst I don't yet share Edward's passion for soil, I've got a feeling I'm going to have to go and dig myself a bucket full and have a look. For me, there is something very special about the natural world as opposed to the developed world or the farmed world even. At a couple of meetings ago, I looked rather quizzical at the idea of replacing farmland with solar panels. And A couple of members of this group very kindly sent me all sorts of helpful information afterwards to improve my knowledge. Genuinely, I was grateful. It did show, I think, that there are ways of doing things like that that will generate biodiversity, but it's not automatic. None of these things happen unless we actually require it of the people who are doing the developments. There are ways of doing these things that will help, but unless we actually put in those restrictions, it won't happen. As to what we've already lost, I'm going to go all poetic on you at the moment. It's fantastic at the moment hearing the birds starting to sing again as spring winds up. And gets going, but you won't hear a turtle dove this spring. You won't hear a curlew this spring. A farmer friend of mine locally rang me up because he saw a flock of lapwings. He hasn't seen them around for years. We have already lost so much. We need to work really hard to even put the brakes on, let alone reverse the decline in biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. What with your poetry and Edward's soliloquy on soil, I will be out in my garden grubbing around tomorrow, seeing what I can find. Is there anybody that hasn't spoken yet who would like to make a comment? No. Andrew, is there anything further you'd like to add at the end of that discussion?
I think I'd just like to say you have a very substantial asset in the length of footpaths and public rights of way. And I think that's an important thing to try and look to enhance in the future. You know, there are going to be opportunities through these local nature recovery strategies and so forth. Can more be done to link up these footpaths? Can more be done to make larger areas of land along footpaths, you know, as natural spaces and so forth? I think that would be a very important and useful thing to consider.
Okay. If nobody has any more comments on this topic, I'm going to move to the Q&A part of this, which Lois from UDC is going to take us through. Thank you, Lois.
Yes, good evening. There are several statements and one or two questions which I'm not sure that we can answer just yet, but I mean, top of the bill, or joint top of the bill, is a question about, do we know what proportion of our green infrastructure is actually publicly accessible, and then and related to that, who owns it? Now, I think we'll have to find out about that, and we'll post the answer on the website, but clearly that's important, you know, following from the discussion that we just had, and especially, you know, people like Eleanor are saying, you know, you need the open space, and you need to have it accessible. On the more of the biodiversity front, there's a question here around the strategies. What strategies are in place to ensure that developers will meet and execute on the requirements of biodiversity net gain, and how are they held accountable? And then lower down, there's a sort of related question about how is this, which has been picked up already this evening, about how it will be monitored and enforced. So, I mean, those are questions really for the planning system and our local plan to make sure that we actually do recognise that and include policies to reflect that. And then we have a question or a pledge or a request really to encourage us to go further than the 10% biodiversity net gain and in our plan, and to look at trying to include a higher percentage, and they're suggesting 20%, but obviously we'd need to do some research on that, but certainly that's something that we'll consider. And then there's one more really, which I'll just read this one out. It's about access to woodlands, and talking about the lockdown has seen very large numbers of people, as we know, walking and enjoying the countryside, and therefore placing increased pressure on the footpaths, which I think was mentioned by a member of the forum as well. However, we do have little access to woodlands, and many of them are used to raise pheasants for private shoots and so on. So again, similar question to the first one, are there plans to increase the woodlands across Uttlesford and to encourage obviously more public, or to enable more public access to them as well? Now, I know that Essex is planning to plant several thousand, I think it's 375,000 new trees as part of the forestry initiative across the county. I mean, obviously not all of those are going to go in Uttlesford, but we will see more tree planting. And again, as part of the biodiversity net gain, we can be working with the developers on their nature the plans that they will have to propose as part of their development, and to make sure that we do actually have a greater variety of biodiversity as a result of their development rather than less. So I mean, that's my response as a planner to some of those questions. I'm not sure if there are any more. There aren't any more questions. Oh, there's another, sorry, one's just popped up here about Hatfield. These have just got one. This is rather a long one here. This is about Hatfield, the Nature Reserve at Hatfield Forest and the SSSI, which of course perhaps skews the figures because it makes up 3/4 of the infrastructure in the district. Put under a lot of pressure over the last few years because of access to it, and I've just lost it. And also, again, this is mentioned by the forum, potential soil erosion as well. So what they're asking here, that we urgently need in the district another large green open space. Again, one of the forum members made this point, to mitigate really the impact on Hatfield Forest. So, you know, it talks, Hatfield Forest isn't of course a park or garden in that sort of sense, but it is an open space, but we need spaces like that, or big spaces like that, which to enjoy. So that's a good point there. There's something else, there's an interesting point that, is there something that we could consider in the size of people's gardens? So rather than having subdivision of gardens, can we protect that? I don't know whether they're suggesting that we have larger garden sizes to permit more biodiversity as well, but that's another point. And that is it. There's quite a range there. A lot of them will impact on our plan preparation work. So very good points.
Thank you. Frank, did you want to just add something?
Yes, there's one other Q&A, the very top one, Stuart Withington. I don't think Lois covered that. About a scoring system for green infrastructure. I assume this is a question that Andrew Lovett might tackle.
Oh yes, sorry, I didn't see that one. Sorry.
Do you want to just read that one out, Lois?
Yes, sorry. The question is there an actual scoring system for green infrastructure so that certain areas, for example, ancient woodland, might be considered to be more valuable, say, than a football pitch? So therefore, although it sort of looks green on the map, you'd actually get more points around preserving it and enhancing it. And therefore, should developers, place more emphasis on improving those areas and not just say, oh, there's just green open space, that it all has the same amount of value.
Do you want to answer that, Andrew?
Yeah, I don't know of a widely used standardized scoring system of that type. I understand the point.
Yeah. Would you think such a thing would be useful?
I can see the merit of it. You'd have to think about how you were going to try and assess the qualities of the habitat. That's the challenge.
Yes. I think if Jackie Coleman, who represents sport, was here, she would say the football pitch is more useful than the woodlands. Samantha.
Yes, just a comment about developers and the current treatment of trees. We find that developers cut down trees preemptively, while even before they might put a planning application in. We quite often find that those trees were mature trees that we'd never thought to put a TPO on, and we find afterwards that regardless of whether the planning application gets granted, those trees are destroyed. So the application might not even be successful, and yet those trees are gone. And each tree just has such a substantial effect on the environment, a beneficial effect, and that they're an irreplaceable resource. So I wondered, is there something that we can do? Because we've contemplated going around and tracking all the trees that we value, but nobody has the time to protect every single tree. So we need some kind of protection for them that doesn't just rely on tree preservation orders, I think. Does anyone have any views?
Lois or Andrew? Yes, Lois.
Andrew, do you respond first?
Okay. Yes, trees are very important. One thing I would mention is that it's technically now possible to map trees and hedges on a district or county scale. You can use sources of information, something called LiDAR, which is now publicly available from the Environment Agency. And it's sufficiently detailed in terms of measuring differences in heights that you can actually pick out individual trees or hedge lines and so forth. I know this because Norfolk County Council have made available a tree and hedge map of the entire county, and it's got I have a relatively small apple tree in my tiny back garden, and it's even got that in it. There is the ability to map those sorts of features and to use them in assessments and monitoring in the future.
Thank you.
We
Lovett,
could,
do you want to add something?
Shall I just say, sorry, Andrew, did you want me to? Andrew, we could find out whether we've got that, whether that's been used in Essex, but I haven't heard about that, but we can find that out. Now, I was just going to add a tiny little point about trees and landscape and views and nature area protection through neighbourhood plans, because obviously we're talking about the local plan for the whole district, but through the neighbourhood planning process, which is obviously at a much more more detailed scale, there is the opportunity for those neighbourhood plan groups to actually propose the protection of areas which haven't got the tree protection, tree preservation order on them as well. So that's another mechanism.
Thank you. Edward?
Yes, just a couple of questions. I'm interested to hear that there is no scoring system for green infrastructure. So how on earth is anyone going to calculate net gain, net biodiversity? If you've got this concept of net biodiversity gain of 10%, someone must be counting something somehow. So how, I can't square the notion of you don't have a scoring system with the fact that you're going to end up with 10% of something. And my other question is, with tree preservation orders, do we need to now redefine what amenity is? Because I think trees, to get a TPO, they have to have amenity value. And I'm not quite sure what amenity value is, but I have a feeling it was defined long before we were concerned about biodiversity. And is there a biodiversity value in amenity, which will then start counting all the microorganisms and insects that are hosted by an ancient oak tree rather than a dozen saplings?
Andrew, do you have an answer to those two? Maybe not.
I do know that with the biodiversity net gain proposals, there are developments going on at the moment to produce something that's called an ecometric. So that is, I think, the metrics that are going to be used to try and assess this biodiversity net gain. But I would entirely agree that it's a big challenge to try and do it.
Thank you very much. Samantha, I think you'll be the last comment, if that's okay.
Yes, I just wondered if there could be some sort of presumption in favour of protecting the tree rather than actively seeking to, in the first place, protect it, just to have a presumption that people shouldn't destroy it and having some kind of stricter penalty for destruction of things that we value.
Andrew, do you have any comment on that?
Sorry, I was still trying to think about ecometric, I'm afraid, sorry.
I think it's about the protection of trees, and I think a lot's been said about trees on this discussion. And in fact, I think trees, footpaths and green spaces have come up in virtually every discussion we've had on this forum. And it's very clear that people feel very passionately about it. And so I will again urge everybody to go onto the website and make all their views felt about that. And if you've posted a question on the Q&A and we haven't managed to mention it, please go on and make your views known so that the officers can take this forward for the local plan. Andrew, thank you so much for your presentation today. It's been really thought-provoking, and you can see there's been a big reaction from the stakeholders present here today to it. So thank you very much for that. And what will happen now is that there is a consultation document on the UDC website and the public can go on and view that. and any comments received from the forum and members of the public received by the 10th of March will be summarised by officers and discussed at the forum meeting back here on the 24th of March. Comments received after this date will be taken into account by officers when preparing the draft local plan, but obviously will not be able to come back here for comment. Hope that's all clear to everybody, and thank you again to Andrew. We're now going to move on to go back to a theme we discussed at the beginning. So if you want to stay with us, Andrew, please do. It's actually, in fact, on climate change, so you may want to stay with us. But if you need to leave us, then thank you very much. Tony, also thank you very much for your comments. If you want to stay and listen about climate change, that's great. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us as a guest today. We are now moving on or back to the subject of climate change, which was theme 3. And I'm going to ask Elishba from UDC to talk us through the summary of the comments that were left on the website on this subject.
Thank you. So the consultation responses we received were collated and then thematically analysed for commonality to enable us to categorise the comments and to summarise these into the 8 categories shown on the infograph supplied. These are sustainable construction methods, parks and open spaces, flood risks, biodiversity, loss of agricultural land, improved connectivity, to improve sustainable transport methods and for potential harm to the landscape. These were then sectioned off into issues and potential mitigation strategies to combat these. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I think that the key points from this were all published in our papers. Did anybody have any comments from reading those? Anything that they wanted to come back on, or anything that seemed to be glaringly missing from those summarised points? Or do people think that the comments left on the website covered them quite well? Richard.
Yes, I was very pleased to see that so many people were commenting in opposition to solar farms. There seemed to be only one comment in favour, and I suspect that was probably Edward's. But I've actually just written the policy paper for CPRE on solar energy, and I think the real problem with this is that yes, there may be advantages in terms of the quality of the soil simply through the fact that it's non-till. But that is very largely, well, almost entirely offset by other factors, such as the use of chemicals, including the solar panels, such as the change to the soil through the shading, through the runoff of water. We don't know the impact, but we can guess. And so I think there is that. But the bigger thing, which everybody is commenting on, is the damage it does to the landscape. And I mean, you've only got to go and look at what is happening to the east of Thaxted to see how damaging these are to the natural landscape. And it's going to be even worse when all the security fencing and everything else is up. And so that is the issue that people seem to be raising. And I would just ask that to be taken on board by the planners, and also the fact that there is now a petition running to try and stop these things within our district. So I just want to highlight that point that came out of the consultation.
Thank you very much, Richard. Edward?
Yeah, I think there's just a spello in the very last section on agricultural land. It's the penultimate bullet point. It says, seek financial compensation for agricultural landowners. And I'm sure it should be seek financial compensation from agricultural landowners. So that's worth getting that right. And then there was, right towards the beginning, there was the notion of sustainable construction should not be at the cost of delivering affordable housing. And that kind of worries me, because I think if we're in a mindset of thinking sustainable and affordability are opposite, or it's a zero-sum game, and I think I think there is every chance that you can have affordable housing that's also sustainable. And I don't think we should be in a mindset that sees those as in opposition at all. And especially, I think I was making the point that affordability should be looked at in the same time frame as sustainability. For as long as you assess them in different time frames, one is a bottom line this year, sustainability is over decades or generations, you will start thinking they are in conflict when they're not, and then we really will be on hiding to nothing. And I think there's nothing in here about, it talks about sustainable construction methods, but doesn't say much about sustainable construction materials and using materials that are carbon sinks. So particularly using wood and using concrete substitutes that are carbon sinks.
Thank you. Thanks, Edward. Eleanor, did you have your hand up or have you put it down?
Well, I was just going to say I'm surprised that the how much emphasis they put on education. I would have thought that we're sort of aware of these things now. Yeah, I mean, they've written just as much about education as the sustainable construction methods. So I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, just it's surprising to me that that's right up there.
Not so surprising to me, actually, just because I think that your generation, if I can say that, your generation are very, very well informed about these things. And I suspect that when I was at school, it was never mentioned many, many years ago. So that didn't surprise me quite as much as it might you. Frank, would you like to?
Yeah, a couple of things that hit me particularly. The idea that the cost of climate change enhancements to new developments should actually be shared amongst the landowners, the developers, the buyers, and possibly with some government subsidy as well. But it's not one person or one group's problem, it's everyone's problem. It should be a shared cost. As for solar panels, I think I would agree with the solar farm issue as not being a very good move. But I would say that there does need to be that big push to fit solar panels onto new constructions, actually on buildings as opposed to fields, and on existing buildings as well, where it's actually sensitively possible. Obviously, it isn't in every case, but I'm sure there are ways that a lot more buildings could have solar panels if we actually tried a bit harder. And one last point about Stansted Airport expansion. As far as I can see, this goes far beyond the current underused limit anyway, and it was underused even before the impact of the pandemic. So that, to me, that's one of the biggest climate change factors we've got in this district, of the thought of making Stansted Airport take even more traffic than it's already, currently doing. Okay,
Frank. Yeah. Eleanor, did you want to make a quick point again, and I'll come to Samantha?
Yeah, so just on what Edward was saying, I've been quite negative, I suppose, this week. But again, I don't think
I wouldn't say that.
So I think affordability is really important, and we don't want really, maybe they're really sustainable, but if we just end up with loads of really expensive houses, I don't think that's solving the problem at all. So I think we do need a balance rather than steering too far in one direction.
I think Edward's agreeing with you. Is that right, Edward? Yes, he is. Samantha.
Yes, as for education, I do think it's important. Many people just assume that we can fly off to exotic locations, and we've got used to that privilege over the last however many years. And we need to really get used to not flying just because it's that sort of luxury feeling of getting away from everything. I do think we need to re-educate ourselves about how we can have leisure time that doesn't damage the environment, and using other methods of travel. So for instance, there is the Eurostar. If we have all electric railways, we can take holidays to other places and we don't have to fly. We need to really focus on what we can do and what is ethical from a consideration of what's good for our kids and their children and future generations. Affordability is an absolute crucial thing. There were 20% of people in poverty in Britain, I think, before the pandemic, and Lord knows how many are now. So we do need affordable housing, and it's not really a question, as you say, a zero-sum game. We need both things. They're both so important to give people housing and also to protect the world generally. So yes, thank you. As for the solar farms, I signed that petition, and I think we need to preserve our agricultural land, and I fully agree that we need to put solar panels on buildings, and also solar glass is very much coming on. I know it's supposed to be really expensive, so I hear, but maybe we can one day have that in all of our buildings to generate electricity as well.
Thank you very much. Once again, there was lots of things there you've all mentioned that may or may not be in the paper. Please go back and add them. Any more questions that have appeared in the Q&A comments, please go and put them onto the website, because the next thing that will happen is that the presentation of the key points on climate change will be given to the local plan leadership group on the 3rd of March. And then there will be feedback to this forum on climate change on the 10th of March. So I really do applaud UDC for this very circular consultation that's going on, and how well we're all being kept informed. And at this point, I'm moving on to item 6, where we're coming full circle back to our very first theme of where you live, if we can remember back that far. And Stephen from UDC is going to give us a verbal update on where we are in the planning cycle with the theme of where you live. Thank you, Stephen.
Good evening. Thank you, Angela. So just to give you an update on what's happening with the representations received so far on that first theme. On Monday this week, the Council's Local Plan Leadership Group considered the responses received so far on that first theme, where you live. A short summary of the discussion of the Leadership Group for those who didn't listen in. The discussion focused on a couple of areas. Firstly, councillors were keen to see what could be done to encourage more people to engage and make representations. Angela said a number of times tonight, please make sure to make your representations on the council's website, and I'm going to say it again, please do make your reps on the council's website on any theme that's happened already, and any upcoming theme you have up until the 21st of April. Councillors also discussed they wanted to be able to find out not just what people who live in the area think of the area already, but also people who are moving into the area, why they've chosen to move into Uttlesford, and what they like about it, and what maybe hasn't met their expectations. So that was an area which members were interested in finding more about. Similarly, people who worked in Uttlesford but didn't necessarily live in the district, they were interested in finding out what they thought of the district. And linking back to the discussion tonight, they also talked about what can be done to improve existing paths and open spaces. So the links between where you live and biodiversity and all the themes interlink. Yes, very interesting. Yes, I think that's it. That's my short summary.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It's great to hear how these subjects are progressing through the local plan. So now moving on, our upcoming theme is the local economy on the 24th of February. And I think we already have a guest speaker for that, who is Paul Cowie from the Centre for Rural Economy at Newcastle University. So that's great news. That sounds very interesting indeed. I'm sure Janet's gearing up for that. Are you, Janet? Yes, she's preparing already. Good. So I'm now just moving on to any other business. Is there anything anyone else would like to add before we say good night? No, thank you so much, everybody, for coming and adding your views. Really interesting discussion. Thank you very much. We see you in 2 weeks' time. Thanks. Bye-bye.